Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natonia Young, and I'm the program coordinator here at our Hancock County unit. Today, we are going to do a Kids Lit program reading the book Ruby the Copycat. When we finish the book, we have 3 different activities that you guys can participate in with your family or with your siblings at home. So, let's get started. Ruby the Copycat by Peggy Rathman. Monday was Ruby's first day in Miss Hart's class. Class, this is Ruby, announced Miss Hart. Ruby, you may use the empty desk behind Angela. Angela is a girl with a pretty red bow in her hair. Angela smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Angela's bow and tiptoed to her seat. So these are going to be our main characters. We have Miss Hart. This is Ruby. And we have Angela. I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend, said Miss Hart. Does anyone have something to share? I was a flower girl at my sister's wedding, said Angela. That's exciting, said Miss Hart. Ruby raised her hand halfway. I was a flower girl at my sister's wedding, too. What a coincidence, said Miss Hart. Angela turned and smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at the top of Angela's head. Class, please take out your reading books, said Miss Hart. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped all the way home on one foot. When Ruby came back to school, she was wearing a red bow in her hair. She slid into her seat behind Angela. I like your bow, whispered Angela. I like yours too, whispered Ruby. Class, please take out your math books, said Miss Hart. On Tuesday morning, Angela wore a sweater with daisies on it. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped home sideways. When Ruby came back to school after lunch, she was wearing a sweater with daisies on it. I like your sweater, whispered Angela. I like yours too, whispered Ruby. So, at this point in the story, we can tell that everything Angela does, Ruby likes to do. So we see their matching red bows, and Ruby even went to the extent of going home, getting her purple sweater, and actually pinning daisies on her sweater so that she can look like Angela. And then we can also evaluate the math problems. She has 7 plus 8. Ruby has 9 plus 7. Although the answers are completely different, Ruby is still copying Angela's answer. So let's see how the story continues. On Wednesday, Angela wore a hand-painted t-shirt with matching sneakers. After lunch, Ruby hopped back to school wearing a hand-painted t-shirt with matching sneakers. Why are you sitting like that? Whispered Angela. Wet paint, said Ruby. On Thursday morning, during sharing time, Angela modeled the flower girl dress she wore at her sister's wedding. Ruby modeled her flower girl dress too, right after lunch. Angela didn't whisper anything. So at this point, we see Angela getting very upset and very frustrated because now Angela sees that Ruby is doing everything that she's doing. By coincidence, on Friday morning, both girls wore red and lavender striped dresses. At lunchtime, Angela raced home. And you can see how upset Angela is and how furious she is. That's not good. When Angela came back to school, she was wearing all black. On Friday afternoon, Miss Hart asked everyone to write a short poem. Who would like to read first? Asked Miss Hart. Angela raised her hand. She stood by her desk and read. I had a cat I could not see because it stayed in back of me. It was a very loyal pet. It's sad we never really met. That was very good, said Miss Hart. Now who's next? Miss Hart looked around the room. Ruby? Ruby stood and recited slowly. I had a nice pet, who I never met, because it always stayed behind me. And I'm sure it was a cat too. So now even the kids in the classroom see, and you can see the looks on their faces, how shocked they are. Because Ruby copies everything Angela does. Ruby smiled at the back of Angela's head. Someone whispered. Ruby sat down. What a coincidence, murmured Miss Hart. Angela scribbled something on a piece of paper. She passed it to Ruby. The note said, You copied me. I'm telling Miss Hart. P.S. I hate your hair that way. Ruby buried her chin in the collar of her blouse. A big tear rolled down her nose and plopped onto the note. When the bell rang, Miss Hart sent everyone home except Ruby. So now Angela is frustrated because she isn't able to do what she wants to do. She's not able to be herself because everything Angela does, Ruby does it. And so because Angela is frustrated, she gave the nasty note to Ruby, and it hurt Ruby's feelings. So now Ruby is crying. Miss Hart closed the door of the schoolroom and sat on the edge of Ruby's desk. Ruby, dear, she said gently, you don't have to copy everything Angela does. You can be anything you want to be. But be Ruby first. I like Ruby. Miss Hart smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Miss Hart's beautiful polished fingernails. Have a nice weekend, said Miss Hart. Have a nice weekend, said Ruby. So let's get a closer look at those nails. Those nails that Ruby absolutely adored. On Monday morning, Miss Hart said, I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend. I did. I went to the opera. Miss Hart looked around the room. Does anyone have something to share? Ruby waved her hand. Glued to every fingernail was a pink plastic fingernail. I went to the opera too, said Ruby. She did not, whispered Angela. Miss Hart folded her hands and looked very serious. Ruby, dear, said Miss Hart gently, did you do anything else this weekend? Ruby peeled off a fingernail. I hopped, said Ruby. The class began to giggle. Ruby's ears turned red. But I did. I hopped around the picnic table 10 times. Ruby looked around the room. Watch. So now Ruby has taken off her fingernails that she put on to match Miss Hart so that she can show the class. And so look at the expression on her classmates' faces. Ruby sprang from her desk. She hopped forward, she hopped backwards. She hopped sideways with both eyes shut. So now we can see that Ruby is an awesome hopper. The class cheered Ruby and clapped their hands to the beat of Ruby's feet. Ruby was the best hopper they had ever seen. Miss Hart turned on the tape player and said, Follow the leader. Do the Ruby hop. So Ruby led the class around the room while everyone copied her. So now instead of Ruby being the copier, the class is the hot copier and Ruby is the leader. And at noon, Ruby and Angela hopped home for lunch. The end. So, the next thing that we're going to do is discuss a few activities that go with the story. Parents, if you guys are watching, one of the things that you can discuss, the number one thing, is about being confident in yourself, and allowing the children to give you their version of the story and how did they take it. We also will, another thing that's good to discuss with members would be being yourself and being oh my God, I literally just made it 10 minutes.